Under the silent rain of Manchester, a woman faces grief and the memories of a suffocating marriage. But when her own son replicates the abusive traits of his deceased father, a threatening cycle resurfaces. What begins as a family reunion transforms into a confrontation that reveals long-hidden truths. And in the heart of the Heritage Quarter, a woman discovers that it's never too late to start over, even after 40 years of silence. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching us from. We're continuing. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear in your life. The New Orleans sky seemed to weep along with Grace Almeida. At 58, she watched the rain lashing the Louisiana city through the living room window of her colonial home in the French Quarter, while the echo of condolences still resonated in her ears. It had only been a few hours since Anthony, her husband of 38 years, had been buried in St. Louis Cemetery, after succumbing to a prolonged illness that had sapped his strength in recent months. The two-story house, with its turquoise facade and white trim, was now silent, except for the tinkling of raindrops in the gutters. The walls, once covered with paintings chosen by Anthony, almost all portraits of him at different stages of life, or with influential politicians and businessmen, seemed to watch her with accusing eyes. Grace ran her fingers through her grey hair pulled back in a tight bun. She still wore the black dress she had chosen for the wake. The flowers filling the room, wreaths and arrangements sent by partners, friends and family, were already beginning to wilt, spreading a sweet and melancholic scent through the air. "Mum, you need to eat something." Jane, her 32-year-old daughter, entered the room carrying a tray with tea and toast. Tall and with delicate features like her mother's, but with her father's dark brown eyes, Jane was Grace's safe harbor. She always had been. "It's been almost 2 days since you've eaten properly." "I'm not hungry, my dear," Grace replied without taking her eyes off the window, where the lights of the historic city began to glow against the darkening sky. "I just want some silence to organize my thoughts." Jane placed the tray on the hand-carved coffee table and sat beside her mother. In silence, she took her hands in hers, tired hands, with short, unpolished nails, hands that had cared for an entire family without ever asking for anything in return. The moment of quiet was interrupted by the sound of the front door slamming shut. Roderick, her 36-year-old eldest son, burst into the room like a hurricane. Tall like his father, with broad shoulders and a prominent chin, he was Anthony's spitting image in his youth. He carried with him the same authoritarian air and brusque gestures that Grace knew so well. "Why didn't you cry?" Roderick's voice was as harsh as sandpaper. He took off his black jacket and loosened his tie, while staring at his mother with eyes red from anger and suppressed tears. Grace sighed. "Son, each person deals with pain in their own way." "No." He slammed his fist on the table, making the cups clatter. "You've always been like this, cold as a stone. Dad deserved more. He always deserved more." Jane stood up, placing herself between her brother and mother. "Roderick, stop. This isn't the time for this." "Don't interfere, Jane." Roderick pointed a finger at his sister. "You always defended her, always complicit in this charade. Dad built all of this." He gestured to the house around them. "He gave everything to this family, and on his last day, what did he get? Indifference." Grace remained silent, her hands now resting on the lap of her black dress. It was as if she had lived that scene countless times before. "You're drunk, Roderick." Jane's voice was firm, but trembling. "I'm lucid enough to see what has always happened in this house." Roderick walked around the table, approaching his mother. His face was contorted with pain and fury. "Dad knew. He told me how you never truly loved him, how you married for interest, how your father never understood what love was, Roderick." Grace finally spoke, raising her gaze to her son. "And I fear you've inherited that inability." It was like striking a match near gasoline. Roderick lunged forward, his eyes glazed with fury. What happened next was etched in Grace's memory like a black and white photograph. Her son, in the same spot where his father's coffin had been displayed hours earlier, raising his hand against her. The sound of the slap echoed through the room, freezing time. Jane let out a muffled cry. The flowers seemed to wilt a little more, and the silence that followed was heavier than any words ever spoken in that house. The red mark on Grace's face stung, but not as much as the pain in her chest. It wasn't the first time she had felt that pain. She knew it all too well. "Get out of my sight." Grace's voice was low but carried an authority she had never shown before. "Now!" Roderick seemed to awaken from a trance, looking at his own hand as if it were a strange object. He mumbled something unintelligible, took a step back and then stumbled towards the stairs leading to the second floor. When the sound of his footsteps faded, Jane knelt before her mother. "Mom, I'm so sorry." He wasn't thinking straight. The pain doesn't justify violence, my dear. Grace touched her daughter's face tenderly. It never did. That night, lying in her bed, the same one she had shared with Anthony for almost 4 decades, Grace let her mind wander through the past, like someone flipping through an old photo album. She saw herself at 20, a simple girl from rural Louisiana, daughter of a laundress and a fisherman, arriving in New Orleans with dreams bigger than her cardboard suitcase. She wanted to study, to become a teacher. She rented a tiny room near the State University of Louisiana and got a job as a sales clerk in a fine fabric store downtown. It was there that she met Anthony Nogueira, 15 years her senior, owner of several properties in the French Quarter, and heir to a small cocoa export empire. He entered the store to order fabrics for his new sofas and left with Grace's phone number. The courtship was swift and dazzling. Anthony was polished, cultured, well-traveled, everything Grace's father was not. He took her to expensive restaurants, gifted her delicate jewelry, promised her a life without worries. For a young woman who had grown up counting pennies to buy notebooks, it seemed like a fairy tale. The marriage proposal came 6 months later, accompanied by a sapphire ring that weighed on her slender finger. Grace hesitated. She wanted to finish her studies first. But her mother, seeing a chance for a better life for her daughter, encouraged her to accept. "You can study later, my dear. An opportunity like this doesn't come twice." Anthony promised she could continue studying after the wedding, a promise that was forgotten as soon as the golden band sealed her fate. The honeymoon in Charleston, South Carolina was wonderful, but upon returning to the colonial house in the French Quarter, Grace discovered that the fairy tale had pages that had not been read. First it was small things, opinions about her clothes. "That dress is too flashy for the wife of a man of my position." About her friendships. "That college friend of yours has very modern ideas. She's not good company." About her spending. "You need to learn the value of money, even if you don't lack anything now." When she became pregnant with Roderick, just a year after the wedding, Grace believed that the arrival of their child would soften Anthony's heart. For a while it worked. The birth of the boy, his father's perfect image, filled the house with joy. Anthony displayed his son like a trophy, proud to have an heir to his name and his businesses. But the honeymoon with fatherhood didn't last long. Soon Anthony returned to his business trips, his nights out, his constant criticisms, and Grace, now with a baby to care for and increasingly isolated from friends and family, began to shrink within herself, building a silent fortress where she kept her grievances and disappointments. The rain continued to fall over New Orleans, washing the cobblestone streets of the French Quarter. Grace closed her eyes, but sleep did not come. In her mind, Roderick's earlier question echoed, "Why didn't you cry?" The answer, which she would never say aloud, was simple. One does not cry for the end of what has long been dead. The next morning brought the sun that illuminated the colorful houses of the French Quarter, making the blue walls of the Nogueira house shine against the clear sky. Grace woke before dawn, as she had always done throughout those years. Deep-seated habits do not easily break, even when the person for whom they were created is no longer present. She put on her slippers, slipped her robe over her nightgown, and went down to the kitchen. The hydraulic tile floor still bore footprints from the night before, probably Roderick's, who must have come down for another bottle. Grace filled the kettle, lit the stove, and leaned against the marble counter, observing the inner garden through the kitchen window. The small courtyard, inspired by colonial architecture, was her refuge. There she had planted jasmine, hibiscus, and a mango tree that now shaded almost the entire space. It was in that garden that, over the years, she found moments of peace, away from her husband's critical eyes and the expectations of the outside world. "You woke up too early." Jane's voice came from the kitchen door. Her daughter had disheveled hair and swollen eyes from not sleeping well. "Some habits are hard to break, my dear," Grace smiled, taking 2 cups from the cabinet. "Tea," Jane nodded, sitting at the rustic wooden table. They remained silent as the chamomile tea brewed, filling the kitchen with its gentle aroma. Outside, the first rays of sun touched the garden flowers. "Has Roderick come down yet?" Grace finally asked, placing the steaming cups on the table. Jane shook her head. "I think he's still asleep. I heard noise in his room late into the night." Grace sighed, bringing the cup to her lips. The gesture caused the sleeve of her robe to lift slightly, revealing purplish marks on her wrist, old marks from fingers that had squeezed too hard. Jane noticed, but didn't comment. She knew those marks. She had seen many of them throughout her childhood, always in places that clothes could hide. "Mom," she began hesitantly, "what are you going to do now?" "About Roderick, I mean." Grace put her cup down on the table, thoughtful. "I don't know, daughter. Your brother is lost in his own labyrinth, just like his father. You never really told me. What was it like at the beginning? With Dad?" A sad smile formed on Grace's lips. "At the beginning? It was like a dream. Like all stories that start well and end badly." Grace returned to the past once more. After Roderick's birth, her marriage to Anthony settled into a monotonous and suffocating routine. He spent days away on business trips, leaving her alone with the baby in the large French quarter house. When he returned, he demanded perfection, impeccable dinners, the house in order, the child well-behaved, the wife well-dressed, but not too provocative. Never that. The first years were of adaptation and hope. Grace believed that, with patience and dedication, she would win her husband's true love. She gave up her studies to be the perfect wife he desired. She learned to manage the house, to host important guests, to smile at the right moments, and to remain silent when her opinion was not requested, which was most of the time. When Roderick turned 4, Grace found herself pregnant again. The news was not received with the same enthusiasm as the first time. Anthony was expanding his businesses, facing problems with competitors, concerned about the country's political instability. A second child, especially a girl, was not in his plans. "Make sure this one doesn't cause as much trouble as the boy," was his only comment when he learned the baby's sex. Jane was born on a warm February night, small and fragile, but with a strong cry that echoed through the corridors of the colonial house. Grace, exhausted from the difficult delivery, felt an immediate connection with that little creature who, unlike her brother, didn't seem like a copy of her father, but bore traces of herself, of her own mother, of her ancestors. Roderick, now almost 5, looked at his sister with curiosity and jealousy. He already displayed his father's strong temperament, demanding, impatient, accustomed to being the center of attention. Jane's arrival changed the family dynamic. Anthony began to dedicate even more time to business and less to family. His trips became more frequent and prolonged. It was around this time that the first physical signs of violence appeared. Until then, Anthony had limited himself to verbal abuse, subtle humiliations, financial and psychological control. But one night, after returning from a particularly stressful trip, he found the house in disarray. Roderick had a high fever, Jane had colic, and Grace hadn't had time to tidy the dining room after the doctor's visit. The slap came without warning, precise and calculated not to leave marks on her face. "You have one job in this house," he hissed through clenched teeth, "and you can't even do that right." Grace swallowed her tears and her pride. Not for herself, but for the children sleeping in the next room. That night marked the beginning of a new chapter in her marriage, one in which fear became her constant companion. "I never understood why you didn't leave." Jane's voice brought Grace back to the present. "Ah, my dear." Grace held her daughter's hand across the table. "Go where?" "With what money?" "With 2 small children? Your grandmother had already passed away, your grandfather was sick. And your father controlled everything. The money, the friendships, even the clothes I wore." Jane nodded, understanding. She had grown up watching her mother fade a little more each day, while her father and brother occupied more and more space in the house and in their lives. "And also," Grace continued, her voice now firmer, "there was you. I couldn't leave you alone in that environment. Your brother was already contaminated. He was already following in his father's footsteps. But you, my dear, you could still be saved." The 2 women held each other's hands across the kitchen table in a silent complicity that had spanned decades. It had always been this way, Grace protecting Jane, Jane supporting Grace, a non-verbal pact between mother and daughter, an alliance forged in the need for emotional survival. As the years passed, the colonial house in the French Quarter witnessed the subtle but inexorable transformation of its internal relationships. Roderick, growing in his father's image and likeness, learned Anthony's lessons early. Noguera men do not show weakness, do not apologize, do not share power. The boy imitated his father's authoritarian gestures, his haughty posture, his imposing tone of voice. At 12, he was already reprimanding his mother for talking too much during dinners. At 15, he demanded that the maid serve him first, even before Anthony. Jane, on the other hand, developed an acute sensitivity to perceive the emotional storms brewing in the house, even before the thunder began. She learned to read the signs: her father's tense jaw, her mother's downcast gaze, the heavy silence that preceded the explosions. She developed distraction strategies, innocent questions that diverted Anthony's attention when he started to pick on Grace. Small domestic accidents that created diversions in the most tense moments. At night, when the house slept, Jane often slipped into her mother's room, on occasions when Anthony was traveling, and there, in the dark, they listened to music softly on the radio, exchanged stories, dreamed of a freedom that always seemed too distant. "Did you regret staying?" Jane asked, bringing Grace back to the present once more. Grace reflected for a moment, observing the sun that now fully illuminated the inner garden. "You can't change the past, my dear, but I can say that if I had the courage I have today, I would have done differently." The sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs interrupted the conversation. Roderick appeared at the kitchen door, disheveled and with deep dark circles under his eyes. His gaze deliberately avoided Grace's, fixing on some undefined spot on the wall. "Good morning," he mumbled, heading for the coffee maker, as if he were alone in the kitchen. "There's coffee ready in the thermos," Grace said, keeping her voice neutral, "and there's bread in the basket." Roderick served himself in silence, sitting at the table, but maintaining distance from the women. The tension was palpable, like static electricity before a storm. "About last night," he began, still not looking directly at his mother. "It's not the first time someone has raised a hand to me in this house," Grace interrupted, with surprising calm. "But it will be the last." The silence that followed was as deep as an abyss. Roderick stared at his mother, surprised by the firmness in her voice. For an instant, he didn't see the submissive woman he had known all his life, but a stranger with a determined gaze and an upright posture. The metamorphosis disconcerted him. "Mom, I wasn't thinking straight. Dad's lost, the stress." He tried to articulate an excuse, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "Your father always had excuses too," Grace replied, getting up from the table. "Work, tiredness, strong temper, the upbringing he received. There was always a reason for everything, except for true remorse." Jane watched the exchange with apprehension, ready to intervene if necessary. But something had changed. In Anthony's physical absence, it was as if a spell had been broken, allowing long-repressed words to finally flow. "What are you implying about Dad?" Roderick's voice rose, indignation replacing the initial embarrassment. "I'm not implying anything, son. I'm openly stating what has always been a poorly kept secret in this house." Grace adjusted her robe and walked to the kitchen door. Before leaving, she turned one last time. "Your father was not the man you think he was, and I am no longer the woman he made me." With those words, she left the kitchen, walking towards the bedroom she had shared with Anthony for almost 4 decades, the room where now, for the first time, she could breathe without fear. The master bedroom of the colonial house bore Anthony's marks in every detail. The dark wooden 4-poster bed, imported from Portugal when they married. The dark green wallpaper with gold patterns, chosen by him on a trip to New York City. The silver crucifix on the dresser, inherited from his father. The velvet curtains that blocked out light and air, keeping the room always in semi-darkness as he preferred. Grace opened the windows wide, allowing the morning breeze from the Gulf Coast to invade the room, carrying with it the smell of the sea and the distant murmur of the French quarter streets beginning to awaken. She needed air, light, life entering that space which for so long had functioned as a veiled prison. She sat in the reading armchair by the window, a small luxury she had managed to negotiate years ago, arguing that she needed a place to sew. In truth, it was there that, in the rare hours when she was alone, she read the books she hid among the bed linen, novels, biographies, poetry. anything that could transport her away from those walls. The last week had been a whirlwind. The final phase of Anthony's illness required constant care. Even debilitated, he maintained control over everything. Medications, visits, schedules, procedures. Grace had spent sleepless nights, taking his temperature, administering medicines, helping him to eat when his hands no longer obeyed his brain's commands. Roderick visited his father daily, but rarely helped with practical care. He preferred to sit by the bed talking about business, politics, future plans, as if the illness were just a temporary inconvenience. Jane, on the other hand, took turns with her mother on night vigils. But Anthony often dismissed her, preferring Grace's silent and subservient presence. It was on one of those nights, when a high fever left him vulnerable and semi-conscious, that Anthony spoke words he had never uttered before. "You were better than I deserved," he whispered with difficulty, his half-closed eyes fixed on the ceiling. Grace, who was adjusting the pillow under his head, froze. In almost 4 decades of marriage, she had never heard anything resembling recognition. "Rest, Anthony. Don't strain yourself." "No," he insisted, his voice firmer than would be expected from someone in his state. "I need to say, while I still can." His hand, once strong and now fragile as paper, sought hers. Grace hesitated for an instant before intertwining her fingers with his. "I know I wasn't what you deserved," he continued, each word costing a visible effort. "I was afraid." "Afraid?" Grace couldn't hide her surprise. "You were never afraid of anything, Anthony." A weak, bitter smile formed on the man's parched lips. "I was afraid as of you, of what you could be, if I didn't control you." The words hit Grace like stones. She felt her chest tighten, decades of unanswered questions converging on that impossible moment. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "After everything. After so long. Because I don't want to leave." "With this burden," he replied, his eyes slowly closing. "I left a letter." "In my desk. Bottom drawer. You'll understand." Those were the last coherent words he spoke. The next morning he no longer recognized anyone, lost in feverish delirium. 2 days later, he passed away in his sleep, without drama, without goodbyes, leaving behind a divided family and a wife with more questions than answers. Grace hadn't had time to look for the letter. The funeral, organized by Roderick with all the pomp the Noguera name demanded, consumed her energy. Now sitting in that armchair that had been her refuge for so many years, she decided it was time to find out what Anthony had meant. She stood up with determination and walked to the imposing rosewood desk that occupied the opposite corner of the room. The piece, used exclusively by Anthony for his personal correspondence and administration of his assets, had always been forbidden territory for her. Even during his illness, she had respected that space, one of the many invisible boundaries established throughout their marriage. The bottom drawer was locked. Grace hesitated. In another time, she would never dare violate this masculine sanctuary. But this was no longer another time, and she was no longer the same woman. She rummaged through Anthony's bedside table drawer and found a bunch of small keys. On the 3rd attempt, the drawer lock yielded with a metallic click that sounded like a small act of rebellion. The drawer revealed meticulously organized folders: properties, investments, will, insurance, and, at the bottom, a sealed brown envelope with her name written in Anthony's firm, angular handwriting. Grace picked up the envelope with trembling hands and returned to the armchair by the window. The New Orleans sun was already high, illuminating the room with an almost blinding clarity. She took a deep breath and broke the seal. Inside were several handwritten pages. The letter began without preamble, typical of Anthony's direct style. "Grace, if you are reading this, it is because I am no longer here. There is much I should have said in life, but cowardice has always been my greatest flaw, though few knew it. When I met you in that fabric store, you were like a light, young, full of dreams, determined to conquer your place in the world. I, already bitter at 35, heir to a name and a fortune I did not build, saw in you everything I would never be: authentic, genuine, capable of building something from nothing. I convinced myself that I loved you, but what I felt was envy. Envy of your freedom, of your ability to be happy with so little, of the dreams that shone in your eyes. I married you not to share your light, but to control it, diminish it, possess it like another one of my properties. With each passing year, as you adapted to the life I imposed, I hated myself more. Your resignation was a mirror of my cowardice. Every dream of yours I stifled, every opinion I silenced, every mark I left on you, physical or emotional, was a testament to my own failure as a man. Roderick is my greatest regret. I raised him in my image, taught him to see strength where there is only cruelty, to confuse control with love, to repeat my mistakes as if they were virtues. Jane fortunately inherited the best of you. Protect her, help her never to become what we made of you. I do not ask for your forgiveness. That would be another act of cowardice. I only ask that, when I'm gone, you find the pieces of the woman you were before you met me and put them back together. There is still time for you, Grace. For me, there never was. As for material possessions, I have already arranged everything. My lawyer, Dr. Paul Miller, has instructions to transfer the French quarterhouse and a substantial account exclusively to your name as soon as I pass. It is the least I can do after taking so much from you. One last thing, beware of Roderick. He inherited the worst of me, empty pride, insecurity masked as arrogance. Teach him what I never learned, that true strength lies in kindness, not in domination. The life we lived together was not what you deserved, but it was the only one my limitation allowed me to offer. I hope your coming years are free from my control, just as your early years should have been. Anthony Noguera. Grace let the pages fall onto her lap, her chest tight with contradictory emotions. It wasn't the apologies she had never received in life, nor a redemption for decades of abuse. It was something more complex. The belated recognition of an unpayable debt, the confession of a man who, in the end, had seen his own weakness. Tears came then, not for the man she had lost, but for the woman she could have been if she hadn't met him. She cried for the young dreamer from the countryside, for the interrupted studies, for the abandoned friendships, for the never-developed talents. She cried for all the years of silence, of fear, of resignation. She cried until she felt empty, and paradoxically lighter. When she finally dried her tears, the sun was already beginning to change its trajectory in the sky. Grace carefully folded the letter, put it back in the envelope and placed it under her pillow. She stood up, adjusted her dress and looked at herself in the dressing table mirror, the same mirror where, for decades, she had seen the reflection of a diminished, faded woman. Now, despite her red eyes and a face marked by time, she saw something different: determination. She descended the stairs with firm steps. In the living room, she found Roderick and Jane arguing in low voices. Both fell silent when they saw her enter. "We need to talk," Grace announced, sitting in the main armchair, the place that had always been Anthony's, about what happens now. "If it's about the estate—" "I've already spoken with Dad's lawyer," Roderick interjected, his presumptuous tone barely disguising his discomfort from the previous night's incident. "Dr. Miller will receive us on Monday to read the will. I imagine the division will be equitable among the three of us, with you receiving the usufruct of the house." "Of course. It's not about the estate," Grace cut him off, surprising both with her assertiveness. "It's about this family, about what we were and what we will no longer be." Jane approached, sitting beside her mother, instinctively offering support. Roderick remained standing, his arms crossed in a defensive posture. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, suspicious. "Your father was not the man you think he was, Roderick," Grace began, her voice firm. "And I was not the wife he deserved. I was much better than that." Roderick opened his mouth to protest, but Grace raised her hand, silencing him, a gesture she would never have dared to make before. "For almost 40 years, I lived in your father's shadow. I gave up my dreams, my voice, my very essence. I endured humiliations, control, even—" she hesitated briefly— "violence, all to keep this family functioning, to protect you two, to be the wife he demanded I be." Jane held her mother's hand, her eyes welling up. She knew parts of that story, had witnessed fragments over the years, had felt on her own skin the weight of the oppressive environment in which she had grown up. "You're exaggerating," Roderick protested, his face reddening. "Dad always gave us everything, always took care of this family with a firm hand as a man should." "Firm hand?" Grace repeated, a sad smile on her lips. "Is that what he called it when he broke my arm in our 3rd year of marriage because I had dinner with a college friend, without asking permission? Or when he locked me in the room for 2 days because I questioned one of his investments in front of a partner?" Shock was etched on Roderick's face. Jane lowered her eyes. She knew some of these stories, but had never heard them recounted so directly. "He would never do that," Roderick mumbled. But his voice no longer had the same conviction. "He did that and much more," Grace continued, now unable to stop the words she had repressed for so long. "And you know what's worse? You're following the same path. Last night, when you assaulted me, I saw your father in you. The same look, the same contempt, the same inability to deal with a woman who doesn't bow down." The silence that followed was as dense as fog. Roderick stumbled to the sofa and slumped down, his face in his hands. Jane sobbed silently, squeezing her mother's hand as if it were a lifeline. "Why did you never tell us?" Jane finally asked. "Why did you endure all this for so long?" "For you at first," Grace replied, her voice softer now. "Later, out of fear, out of habit, out of not believing I deserved something better. It's hard to explain to someone who has never lived like that. The prison is not just physical, it's mental, emotional, spiritual." Roderick lifted his face, his eyes red but dry. "He told me you never truly loved him, that you married for interest, for money, for social position." Grace laughed, a surprising sound in that heavy moment. "Interest? I was 20, I worked, I studied, I had my own dreams. It was he who saw in me a trophy, a property to be acquired. At first I mistook that obsession for love. When I realized the truth, I was already too trapped to escape." She stood up and walked to the window overlooking the street. Outside, the French Quarter vibrated with its usual routine. Tourists photographing the colorful houses, street vendors offering lucky charms, street musicians playing jazz. Life went on, indifferent to the dramas unfolding within those centuries-old walls. "Your father left a letter," she finally said, still with her back to her children. "A confession, a belated acknowledgement of his mistakes. It doesn't change the past, but at least it closes a chapter." She turned to face Roderick, who seemed to have aged years during that conversation. "And as for you, my son, it's time to decide, do you want to continue your father's legacy, with all the pain it brought, or do you want to write your own story?" The question hung in the air, like the echo of a bell that continues to vibrate long after the chime. Through the open window a breeze blew in, rustling the curtains and bringing the distant sound of a brass band, a reminder that, outside that house of secrets, life pulsed colorful and free. The meeting with the lawyer. The following Monday was brief and surprising. Dr. Paul Miller, a middle-aged man with grey hair and tortoise-shell glasses, received the three Nogueiras in his office on Royal Street, a few blocks from the family home. The location, a restored colonial townhouse, maintained the aura of tradition that characterized Anthony's businesses. Seated in leather armchairs in front of the solid wood desk, Grace, Roderick and Jane listened as the lawyer explained Anthony Nogueira's testamentary dispositions. The surprise came early. Contrary to Roderick's expectations, Anthony had left the French Quarter house and a generous bank account exclusively to Grace. The remaining assets, the commercial properties, the farm in Louisiana Bayou country, the stocks and investments would be divided equally between the two children. "This is absurd," Roderick protested, standing up abruptly. "There must be some mistake." Dr. Miller adjusted his glasses and leafed through the document. "There's no mistake, Mr. Nogueira. Your father altered the will 6 months ago when he received the definitive diagnosis of his illness. He was quite specific about his intentions. He wasn't in his right mind," Roderick insisted, his hands resting on the lawyer's desk. "The medication, the illness, he wasn't thinking clearly." "On the contrary," Dr. Miller replied with professional calm, "your father was lucid and determined. In fact," the lawyer hesitated, looking briefly at Grace before continuing, "he mentioned that this was a belated form of reparation. His exact words were, 'It's the least I can do after taking so much from her.'" Jane cast a meaningful glance at her mother, who remained impassive, her hands clasped on the lap of her simple blue linen dress. She looked different today, her hair loose instead of the usual bun, a soft lipstick on her lips, small pearl earrings she hadn't worn in years. "This is unacceptable," Roderick continued, his voice raised. "I will contest this will. This was not my father's intention. He always said I would take control of the family businesses." "And you will," Grace interjected, speaking for the first time since they entered the office. "All the companies, properties, and investments are being divided between you and your sister. The house and the account are just a pension for my old age. A very generous pension, Roderick retorted bitterly. That house is worth a fortune. It's a historic landmark in the heart of the French Quarter. A house where I lived for almost 40 years, Grace replied, her voice firm but controlled. A house I cared for, preserved, kept alive while your father was busy building the empire you now inherit. Dr. Miller cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the turn of the conversation. If you'll allow me, there are a few more details to discuss. The meeting proceeded tensely, with Roderick making furious notes in a notebook, occasionally casting accusing glances at his mother. Jane, in contrast, seemed relieved, perhaps to see her mother finally receiving something tangible after decades of silent sacrifice. In the end, when Dr. Miller handed each heir copies of the relevant documents, Roderick refused to say goodbye, hastily leaving the office. Jane hugged her mother on the steps of the townhouse, the strong New Orleans sun making them squint. He'll calm down. Mom, he just needs time, Grace nodded, watching Roderick's figure disappear among the tourists and workers circulating on Royal Street. Time. That's all we have now, isn't it? Time without your father's shadow. That night, a typical Louisiana summer storm broke over New Orleans. Lightning intermittently illuminated the colonial house, creating ghostly shadows on the walls. Grace was in the library, reorganizing the books, a small rebellion against the order imposed by Anthony, who insisted on keeping them organized by size and color, not by subject or author. The sound of the doorbell cut through the noise of the rain. It was almost 10 at night, a strange hour for visitors. Jane, who was watching television in the living room, went to answer. Roderick's voice, loud and agitated, reached Grace's ears even before she left the library. When she entered the living room, she found her son drenched, dripping water onto the wooden floor, a plastic envelope protected under his coat. We need to resolve this now, he announced, ignoring Jane's protests for him to calm down. Resolve what, Roderick? Grace asked, maintaining a strategic distance. This! He pulled a folder of documents from the envelope. I brought the transfer papers for the house and the bank account. I want you to sign them, transferring everything to my name. In return, I guarantee you a generous allowance for as long as necessary. The absurdity of the proposal left Grace momentarily speechless. It was Jane who reacted first. Have you lost your mind, Roderick? The house is Mom's by right. That's what Dad wanted. Dad wasn't thinking straight, Roderick retorted, tossing his wet hair back. He was manipulated, confused. This house has belonged to the Noguera family for 3 generations. It can't just go out of our control. Grace observed her son, noticing the telltale signs: dilated pupils, exaggerated gestures, rapid speech. She knew those signs well. She had seen them in Anthony so many times. You've been drinking, she stated simply. What does it matter? Roderick exploded. I'm here to resolve a family problem as the man of the house now. It's my responsibility to ensure the Noguera family's assets remain intact. Your responsibility, Grace repeated, taking a step forward. The rain beat against the windows with renewed force, as if trying to get in. Who gave you that responsibility, Roderick? Your father is dead, and even if he were alive, this house is now mine. By right, by merit, by belated reparation. Something in Grace's tone, a firmness never before demonstrated, made Roderick recoil slightly. But the alcohol and wounded pride spoke louder. You don't deserve any of this. You never managed a business, never earned a cent on your own. Everything you have came from my father's work. Work. Grace's voice rose for the first time. Do you call what your father did work? And what did I do for 40 years? I managed this house, raised his children, maintained his social image, endured his abuses, cured his hangovers, covered his tracks when he humiliated waitresses and secretaries, smiled at dinners when my body was covered in bruises. Is that not work, Roderick? The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the rain. Jane, paralyzed near the door, seemed not to breathe. Roderick lowered his eyes for the first time, but his posture was still defensive. I don't believe, he began, but Grace interrupted him. You don't believe it? Ask your sister. She was here, she saw. She heard the nightly screams. She counted the days I couldn't leave the house because the injuries were too visible. She knows. Roderick turned to Jane, a silent question in his eyes. His sister nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. "I tried to tell you so many times," she whispered, "but you idolized Dad so much. And he fed that. He made sure to be different when you were around." "Lie," Roderick mumbled, but without conviction. Long repressed memories began to emerge. His mother wearing long-sleeved blouses in the scorching New Orleans summer, the sudden silence when he entered a room where his parents were talking, Jane's swollen eyes on certain mornings. "It's not a lie, son," Grace said, her voice softer now. "And deep down you know it. Part of you always knew, but it was easier to ignore, more convenient to maintain the image of the heroic father." Roderick slumped onto the sofa, the document slipping from his hands to the floor. He seemed suddenly smaller, younger, more vulnerable. The rain outside diminished, as if mirroring the emptying of anger within the house. "I don't want to be like him," he finally murmured, so softly that the women barely heard him. "But I don't know how to be different. It's all I know." Grace approached cautiously and sat in the armchair opposite her son. She didn't try to touch him. She knew he needed space in that moment of painful revelation. "You can choose, Roderick. We all can choose who we want to be, regardless of what we've learned." "How?" The question came out as a lament. "How do I unlearn all this?" Grace reflected for a moment, her eyes fixed on the rain that was now just a light drizzle. "Starting with the basics: respect, recognition of the other as an equal, and most importantly, learning to ask for forgiveness." A dense silence filled the room. Jane approached and sat beside her brother, hesitantly placing her hand on his shoulder. To both their surprise, he didn't push it away. "I hit you," Roderick finally said, his voice choked. "I did exactly what he did." "Yes," Grace confirmed, without mincing words, "and now you need to decide if that will be a pattern or an exception in your life." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Outside, the rain had completely stopped, leaving only the sound of dripping and the smell of wet earth entering through the windows. I think I need to go," Roderick said after a long moment, standing up. He looked exhausted, as if he had run a marathon. He picked up the documents from the floor and put them back in the plastic envelope. "I'm sorry for coming like this, late at night with these demands. I wasn't thinking clearly." "It's all right, son," Grace replied, remaining seated. "But don't come back while you're like this. This house now has new rules." Roderick nodded without protesting. For the first time in years, he truly looked at his mother, not just through her as he used to do. He saw the marks of time on her face, the dignity in her posture, the strength that had always been there beneath the appearance of submission. "I'm going to my apartment," he said, heading for the door. "I need to think." Jane accompanied him to the entrance, exchanging a few words in a low voice that Grace couldn't hear. When the door closed, the silence that remained in the colonial house seemed different. It was no longer the oppressive silence of the years under Anthony's dominance, but something lighter, more open. Grace slowly climbed the stairs to the master bedroom. She sat on the edge of the bed she now occupied alone and took Anthony's letter from the bedside table drawer. She reread the passage about Roderick. "Beware of him. He inherited the worst of me: empty pride, insecurity, masked as arrogance. Teach him what I never learned, that true strength lies in kindness, not in domination." Perhaps there was still hope for her son. Perhaps the cycle could be broken, but it wouldn't be easy or quick. Patterns ingrained for decades don't disappear overnight. Grace put the letter away and prepared for sleep. For the first time in many years, she didn't close the curtains. She wanted the sun to wake her naturally the next morning. A small freedom, a small pleasure, the first of many she intended to allow herself from now on. 3 days passed without news from Roderick. Grace and Jane established a new routine in the French Quarterhouse. Together they rearranged furniture, removed some of the more oppressive paintings from the walls, opened windows that had been closed for years. Like a plant finally receiving sun after a long time in the shade, the colonial house seemed to gain new life. On the morning of the 4th day, while having coffee in the inner garden, another new habit, as Anthony had always insisted that meals be taken in the formal dining room, they heard the doorbell. Roderick stood on the doorstep, looking very different from when they last saw him. No suit, no tie, wearing jeans and a simple shirt. His disheveled hair and a few days' stubble gave him a younger, less rigid air. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice subdued. Grace made an affirmative gesture, and he followed her into the inner garden, where Jane was already taking another cup from the cabinet. "Coffee?" she offered, with a small smile. "Please," Roderick accepted, sitting hesitantly at the cast-iron table under the mango tree. He observed the space around him, the newly planted flowers, the new arrangement of chairs, the sound of a radio softly playing popular American music. "Things have changed around here." "Many things," Grace confirmed, passing him the breadbasket. The house was in need of fresh air. An uncomfortable silence settled as Roderick drank his coffee, his eyes downcast, avoiding direct eye contact. Finally, after a long sip, he spoke. "I spent these days thinking about everything we talked about Dad, about how he treated you." He paused, taking a deep breath. "At first I didn't want to believe it. It was easier to think you were exaggerating, making up stories. But then I started to remember things, small details that never made sense. And I talked to Aunt Regina." Grace raised her eyebrows, surprised. Regina was Anthony's sister, with whom he had maintained a distant relationship for years. "She confirmed everything," Roderick continued, his voice choked. "She said she tried to warn you several times early in the marriage, but you were too enchanted to see the signs. And then when you realized it was too late." "It's never too late, son," Grace replied softly. "Just harder." Roderick nodded, nervously playing with his spoon. "I also realized something else during these days alone. I realized that I'm following the same path in the company with my fiancé. I'm repeating the same patterns, controlling, demanding, never satisfied." Jane exchanged a meaningful look with her mother, but remained silent, giving her brother space to continue. "I don't want to be like this," he concluded, finally looking directly at Grace. "I don't want to do to Caroline what Dad did to you. I don't want my children, when I have them, to grow up in an environment like this one was." The words hung in the morning air, accompanied by the singing of birds that now regularly visited the garden, attracted by the new flowers and the fresh water Jane left in small containers. "And what do you intend to do about it?" Grace asked, not harshly, but with the frankness she now allowed herself. Roderick ran his hand through his disheveled hair. "I don't know exactly, but I wanted to start by asking for forgiveness. For what I did the other day, for the way I've treated you all these years, for not seeing what was happening right under my nose." Grace observed her son, the firstborn she had tried so hard to protect, even when he became part of the problem. She saw in him now something she had never seen in Anthony: vulnerability, genuine remorse, a desire for change. "Forgiveness is not something granted all at once, Roderick," she finally replied. "It's a process, a path we walk together day after day, choice after choice." He nodded, accepting the answer without protesting, another sign of change. "As for the house and other assets," he continued, "I accept Dad's decision. You deserve that and much more. In fact—" He hesitated, then pulled a thin folder from his pocket. "I brought this. These are the papers for the apartment in the Garden District. I want to transfer it to your name too. It's an apology, and a guarantee that you will never again need to depend on anyone." Grace looked at the folder but didn't take it. "It's not with material possessions that you mend what was broken, son. It's with respect, with recognition, with true change." "I know," he responded quickly, "but it's a start, a tangible way to show that I'm committed to this change." Jane, who was watching the scene with tearful eyes, finally intervened. "He spent the whole night organizing these papers, Mom. We talked on the phone for hours. This means a lot to him." Grace considered for a moment, then accepted the folder, placing it on the table. "Thank you for the gesture, Roderick. I'll think about it. But know that what I value most today is something no material possession can buy: my freedom, my voice, my place in this family." Roderick nodded, and for the first time in days a small smile formed on his face. "I understand, and I'd like to learn more about that, about this new place. about this new mother I'm discovering. The morning sun filtered through the mango, tree leaves, creating patterns of light and shadow on the garden table. A gentle breeze carried the smell of the distant sea and the sound of the first beignet vendors setting up their stalls on the streets of the French Quarter. New Orleans awakened to another day, and in the Noguera colonial house, something new also began to be born. Time in New Orleans has its own rhythm, marked by the tides of the Gulf Coast, by the jazz bands, by the comings and goings of tourists enchanted by the city's colors and flavors. 2 months had passed since the storm that brought Roderick, drenched, to the French Quarter house demanding what wasn't his. 2 months since long-repressed words had finally been spoken. The colonial house gained new life every day. Grace had hired an architect for small renovations. Nothing that would alter the historical heritage, just changes that made the environment more welcoming, more feminine, more hers. The living room walls, once an oppressive dark green, now displayed a soft blue hue. Light curtains replaced the heavy velvet that blocked out the light. Anthony's imposing portrait that dominated the living room had been moved to a less central corner, making way for a beautiful canvas by a local artist depicting the colorful French Quarter. It was Sunday morning and Grace was preparing lunch, now by choice, not by obligation. In recent weeks she had established a new ritual: family lunches on Sundays, gathering Jane, Roderick, and occasionally some friends rediscovered after decades of social isolation imposed by Anthony. "Do you need help, Mom?" Jane entered the kitchen carrying bags of fresh fruit from the French market. "You can finish chopping these vegetables," Grace replied, handing her the knife. "Did Roderick confirm he's coming?" "Yes, and he said he's bringing Caroline," Jane informed with a small smile. "It seems things are getting better between them." Grace nodded, pleased. In recent weeks, she had witnessed a gradual transformation in her son. Not a miraculous change. She knew that patterns ingrained for decades don't disappear overnight, but consistent small signs of someone genuinely committed to changing. Roderick had started therapy, something Anthony had always considered for weak people. He drastically reduced his alcohol consumption. In business meetings, he strove to listen more and impose less. With Caroline, his fiancée of 3 years, he had begun a difficult but necessary process of recognizing toxic behaviors and establishing new communication patterns. The sound of the doorbell interrupted Grace's thoughts. Jane went to answer and soon returned accompanied by Roderick and Caroline, a young architect with olive skin and lively eyes, whom Grace had always found too strong to submit to the controlling behavior Roderick had inherited from his father. "Good morning." "Mom," Roderick greeted, approaching to kiss her cheek. Another new habit, as physical displays of affection were never encouraged in Anthony's house. "Mrs. Almeida, it's a pleasure to see you again," Caroline said, handing her a small pot of orchids. "I brought them for your inner garden. Roderick told me how you've transformed this space." "Thank you, dear." Grace accepted the gift with a genuine smile. "And please, no misses, we're practically family." Lunch proceeded in a light atmosphere, something that would have been impossible just a few months ago. They talked about the new exhibition at the New Orleans Museum of Art, about the jazz festival happening next weekend, about Jane's plans to resume the master's degree in anthropology she had interrupted to care for her ailing father. When dessert, a bread pudding, Grace's grandmother's recipe, was served, Roderick cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "I have some news," he announced, holding Caroline's hand across the table. "We've decided to postpone the wedding." Grace and Jane exchanged surprised glances. The wedding was scheduled for December, just 3 months away. "It's not a cancellation," Caroline quickly clarified. We realize we need more time to build a stronger foundation, to resolve some individual issues before committing for life." "It was my idea," Roderick admitted, surprising everyone. "I realized I was repeating Dad's pattern, rushing everything, controlling everything, more concerned with appearances than with what truly matters." He paused, searching for the right words. "I realized I wasn't ready to be the kind of husband Caroline deserves, the kind of man who wouldn't repeat the mistakes I saw growing up in this house." A respectful silence followed his words. Grace looked at her son with a mixture of pride and melancholy. There was a pain in that belated awareness, in that recognition of toxic cycles, a pain necessary for growth, for transformation. I think that's a very wise decision, she finally said, raising her glass of juice. A toast to the courage to look within, to recognize our demons, and to choose a different path. Everyone raised their glasses, and the clinking of crystal echoed through the sunny dining room. A joyful, promising sound, so different from the oppressive silence that had reigned at that same table for decades. After lunch, while Jane and Caroline chatted animatedly on the veranda, Roderick helped his mother put away the dishes, another small domestic revolution, as Anthony had always considered household chores women's work. "How are the therapy sessions going?" Grace asked casually as she dried the plates her son washed. Roderick sighed, staring at the soapy water. "Difficult, revealing. Sometimes I feel like I'm meeting myself for the first time." He paused, lathering a glass. "She helped me realize how many things I normalized growing up. Behaviors I thought were natural but which are toxic." Grace nodded, understanding. "It's a painful process, but necessary. I myself am only just beginning to unlearn 4 decades of patterns." "You're also doing therapy?" Roderick seemed surprised. "I started a month ago," Grace confirmed with a small smile. "It's never too late to heal, to rediscover yourself." They worked in silence for a few minutes, the sound of water and dishes creating a comforting domestic melody. Outside they could hear Caroline and Jane's laughter, mixed with the sounds of the city that freely entered through the now always open windows. "Mom," Roderick broke the silence, his voice lower and more hesitant. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course, son. Have you forgiven Dad?" Grace stopped what she was doing, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. She looked through the kitchen window at the inner garden, where newly planted jasmine began to bloom. "Forgiveness is a complex word, Roderick," she finally replied. "I don't believe it's something granted all at once, like an absolution. It's more of a process, a gradual detachment from resentment, from anger." She paused, organizing her thoughts. "I haven't forgiven your father in the sense of erasing what he did, of pretending there was no harm. That would be denying my own history, my own pain. But I'm learning not to let that pain define who I am now, who I can be from now on." Roderick nodded slowly, absorbing the words. "And what about me? Have you forgiven me? For the slap? For all the times I was complicit that I turned my back?" Grace turned to face her son, this adult man who, in many ways, was still the boy she had tried to protect, even when he began to become a younger version of Anthony. "With you it's different," she replied softly. "You are here acknowledging, trying to change. That matters, son. It matters a lot." She extended her hand, lightly touching his arm. "And yes, I forgive you. Not to erase what happened, but so that we can build something new, something better." Roderick's eyes welled up, another significant change, as Anthony had always repressed any display of emotion in his son, especially tears which he considered a sign of weakness. Now he didn't try to hide them. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice choked. "I don't deserve a second chance, but I promise not to waste it." "We all deserve the chance to reinvent ourselves, son," Grace replied, returning to drying the plates. "We all deserve the opportunity to break the cycles that imprison us." When they finished in the kitchen, they joined Jane and Caroline on the veranda. The afternoon gently fell over New Orleans, tinging the sky with orange and pink hues. Down below, in the narrow streets of the French Quarter, tourists and locals mingled in the typical Sunday hustle and bustle. A capoeira circle formed in the square in front of the house, the berimbau marking the ancestral rhythm that echoed through the colonial walls. "I had an idea," Jane announced, sitting beside her mother. "What do you think about transforming Dad's old room into an art studio?" "Art studio?" Grace repeated, intrigued. "Yes. Remember how you used to paint when you were young?" Before everything. Aunt Regina told me you had talent, that you even thought about studying art." Grace felt a warmth in her chest, a mixture of surprise and emotion for this piece of her past that her daughter had rescued. It was true. Before meeting Anthony, she dreamed of studying fine arts. She had even taken some free courses. She had notebooks full of drawings, watercolors, sketches of a New Orleans seen through the eyes of a young woman full of dreams. "It's been so long," she murmured, her mind wandering to an almost forgotten past. "It's never too late to start over, Mom," Jane insisted, her eyes shining. "You always postponed your dreams for others. Now it's time to reclaim them." "I support the idea," Roderick declared, surprising everyone again. I can help with the renovation. Caroline is an architect. She can create a perfect design for an art studio, right, honey? Caroline nodded enthusiastically. It would be a pleasure, Grace. We could take advantage of the natural light in that room, which is wonderful. We just need to change the flooring, install some shelves, maybe a large work table. Grace listened to the three of them talking, planning, dreaming. For her, with her. It was a strange and wonderful feeling after a lifetime of having her desires ignored or minimized. I don't know if I still have talent, she confessed, feeling suddenly vulnerable. It doesn't matter, Jane responded firmly. Here it's about the process, about doing something that brings you joy, that is just yours. Besides, Caroline added timidly, my aunt teaches painting classes at the Community Arts Center. I'm sure she'd love to have you as a student. Grace looked at the three young people in front of her, her daughter, who had always been her safe harbor, her son, who was slowly finding a new path, her future daughter-in-law, who brought a refreshing energy to the family. She felt a wave of gratitude so intense that her eyes filled with tears. Thank you, she said simply, for believing in me, for seeing me beyond the role I played for so long. You were always so much more than they allowed us to see, Jane replied, squeezing her hand. Now it's time for all of us to rediscover that truth. Night fell gently over the colonial house, stars beginning to dot the New Orleans sky. In the living room, where the silence imposed by Anthony once dominated, laughter, conversations, and plans for the future now echoed. It was not a perfect family, far from it. There were wounds still healing, patterns still being unlearned, trust still being rebuilt. But it was a family in transformation, consciously choosing a new path. The following week, the renovation of Anthony's room began. The heavy velvet curtains gave way to light fabrics that danced with the breeze. The dark wallpaper was removed, revealing walls that would soon receive a light and cheerful color. The imposing bed was replaced by a wide work table, with drawers for art supplies. Grace enrolled in painting classes at the Community Arts Center. In the first sessions, her hands trembled so much she could barely hold the brush. Decades of internalized self-criticism, Anthony's voice always echoing in her mind, pointing out imperfections, minimizing her talents, made every stroke a challenge. But she persisted. Week after week, brushstroke after brushstroke, she rediscovered not only painting techniques but parts of herself long dormant. Her first completed canvas, a view of the French Quarter at dusk, was far from technical perfection, but it radiated an authenticity, a raw emotion that moved even the teacher, an experienced artist accustomed to student work. A month after starting classes, Roderick unexpectedly appeared at the Community Arts Center, carrying an old leather folder. I found this in Dad's office, he explained, handing it to Grace after class. I think you should see it. Intrigued, Grace opened the folder. Inside, she found her youthful drawings, sketches of the Gulf Coast, studies of people in the squares, watercolors of sunsets over New Orleans. These were works she believed lost for decades, which she no longer even remembered having made. How did he have these? She asked, astonished. Roderick shrugged. They were stored in a folder labeled with your name, locked in a drawer he never opened. I found them when I was organizing the company documents. Grace leafed through the drawings with trembling fingers. It was like finding a lost piece of her soul, a fragment of the young woman she had been before Anthony entered her life and began, systematically, to diminish her. Why would he keep these? She murmured, more to herself than to her son. He always said my drawings were child's play. Perhaps he saw value in them, even if he couldn't admit it, Roderick suggested. Or perhaps keeping them was a form of control. Of possessing even your dreams. Grace nodded slowly. It was a possibility. Anthony had always been possessive, controlling in every aspect of their lives together. Keeping her drawings, hidden where she would never find them, would be typical of him, a way to appropriate even her creativity. Well, now they're back with you, Roderick said, lightly touching her shoulder, where they always should have been. That night in her newly completed art studio, Grace spread her youthful drawings on the floor and sat among them. It was like having a conversation with her younger self, that girl full of dreams and possibilities, before life taught her to make herself small to accommodate the fragile ego of an insecure man. She picked up a new sketchbook, opened it to a blank page and began to draw. She didn't try to replicate the style of her youth. She knew that would be impossible. Instead, she let her hands, now marked by time and experience, find their own way on the paper. What emerged was a portrait of herself, not as she was physically, but as she felt in that moment, a woman reborn from the ashes of a past that no longer defined her. When she finished, she placed the drawing on the wall next to an old family photograph. Anthony. Herself, Roderick and Jane, all serious, posing formally as was customary in photos of the time. The contrast between the rigidity of the photograph and the fluidity of the drawing told, by itself, the story of her transformation. In the months that followed, life in the French Quarter colonial house found a new rhythm. Grace dedicated her mornings to the art studio, her afternoons frequently to walks through the city she rediscovered with new eyes. Jane resumed her master's degree and moved into a small apartment near the university, but visited her mother almost daily. Roderick continued his therapy and his work in the family businesses, now with a more collaborative and less authoritarian approach that positively surprised employees, accustomed to Anthony's intimidating style. One Sunday afternoon, 6 months after Anthony's disappearance, everyone was gathered in the inner garden for the traditional lunch. Caroline, who had finally begun to feel truly part of the family, had brought her grandmother, Mrs. Zeeley, a vibrant 80-year-old lady who charmed everyone with stories of her youth in the vibrant artistic movements of her youth. During dessert, Jane stood up with a solemn expression. "I have an announcement to make," she declared, her voice slightly trembling with emotion. "I've been accepted for a doctorate at New York City University. It's an incredible opportunity, but it means I'll have to move." "Oh, my dear." Grace stood up to hug her. "What wonderful news. I'm so proud of you." "You're not upset that I'm leaving?" Jane asked, insecure. "After everything we've been through." Grace held her daughter's face in her hands. "Upset, how could I be? You're following your dreams, building your path. It's all I've ever wanted for you." "Besides," Roderick added with a mischievous smile, "New York City isn't that far away, and Mom now has a hefty bank account to visit her doctor-daughter whenever she wants." Everyone laughed, and Grace felt a wave of gratitude for the imperfect but loving family they were rebuilding together. Anthony's portrait was still on the living room wall, but now it seemed smaller, less threatening, just a part of their collective history, no longer the defining force of their lives. That night, after everyone had left, Grace sat alone on the veranda, watching the lights of the French Quarter shine against the dark sky. In recent months, she had learned to appreciate solitude, not as the forced isolation she had known for decades, but as a sacred space of self-discovery and peace. The night breeze carried the smell of the distant sea and the sound of live music from a nearby bar. New Orleans lived intensely as always. And now, finally, Grace felt that she too was living, not in someone's shadow, not as an extension of others' needs, but as the protagonist of her own story. In the room that had once been Anthony's and was now her art studio, a freshly finished canvas dried on the easel. It depicted 3 women of different generations, herself, Jane, and Caroline, sitting in the inner garden, their faces illuminated by the golden light of the New Orleans dusk. It was not a technical masterpiece, but it perfectly captured what Grace valued most now: authenticity, connection, the freedom to be who she truly was. Tomorrow, she would hang the painting in the living room, in the place previously occupied by Anthony's stern portrait. Not as an erasure of the past, but as an affirmation of the present and the future she had chosen for herself. An imperfect future under construction, but genuinely hers. And that, Grace discovered at 58, was the most precious of liberations. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Grace, Roderick, and Jane has touched your hearts. To continue this emotional journey, we have prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories. Find it here by clicking on your left. If you are moved by this narrative of rebirth and overcoming, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of American life in its multiple facets. Share your own experiences of new beginnings in the comments. Your story can also inspire those who need courage to take the first step towards liberation. Don't miss our upcoming content. We are waiting for you.